First. Do you hear your finger?
Yep. Okay.
Okay. Should be a little red light.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this Camping Code information session. As a community member, you will have the opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A section of the session. Please use the raise hand function during that time to signal that you would like to participate. This meeting offers closed captions, so please follow the instructions on the screen to view the captions. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta sesión informativa. Miembros de la comunidad tendrán la oportunidad de participar durante la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Por favor, use la función de levantar la mano en Zoom para señalar que usted quiere participar. Durante esta junta tenemos interpretación simultánea al español. Si usted está usando Zoom en una computadora, por favor siga las instrucciones en su pantalla para cambiarse a el canal de audio en español en Zoom. Si usted está usando una tableta o teléfono móvil, por favor siga estas instrucciones que están en la pantalla. Gracias por su participación. Thank you everyone for your participation today, and I will pass it back to the floor. Thank you.
Okay. So, we're here today to talk about the camping code, but we would be remiss if we didn't take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy that took place last evening in our community. We collectively mourn Glenn Edward Bennett and Donald Ray Surratt, and all of those traumatized by this act of violence. I also want to ask for a little bit of grace for the people on this dais, as many of them are operating on no sleep right now and have had a really extraordinarily tough 36 hours. So I just hope we could just take a moment and sort of ground ourselves here and just take a breath and get back to the work that we are doing for the city.
Thank you, Councilor. I think I'm up first. I want to thank everybody who came tonight. This is very important. If it wasn't important, we wouldn't be doing it on this tragic day. Really, the goal for tonight is to share information about the process surrounding this unsanctioned camping code. that the city's embarked upon. You're going to hear about the big picture of houselessness in this community. We want to give you as broad of a picture about the state of homelessness in Bend and a high-level overview of the strategies that the city has used, is using, will use to address it. But I want to be clear that tonight we are talking about process. We're going to go through the unsanctioned camping code as it's been discussed. I also want to make really clear there isn't a draft that's before council right now. We've planned other opportunities for input, for questions related to the development of the code, roundtable meetings, which are new for us at council, and we'll engage key stakeholders once the code is drafted. Those will likely be held in the coming months. And I encourage you all, whether you're online or here tonight, to visit bendoregon.gov/camping-code to track further opportunities to give feedback, to provide input, to ask more questions. I think I speak for everybody up here, want this to be as transparent and give and take flow of information in the bigger process as is possible. Clarity and fairness should be underlying everything we talk about. Again, this code has not yet been drafted. If you've come to city council meetings over the last month or so, you've seen some of the elements that we've discussed. If you've come to city council meetings over the last couple of years, you've seen some of the work that council has done, and you've seen councilors mentioning the need for regulatory clarity when it comes to using public property. We know you'll have input. We know you'll have opinions. We know you'll have valuable information to share with us when it comes to the substance of the code. And there will be ample time, ample opportunity, I believe, for people to provide input on the code substantively before the entire council. You only have 2 councilors up here today. At the end of the presentation, we'll go over the schedule of what we're planning. Tonight is to explain the process, answer your questions about the process. When it is question time, please keep your questions to a minute. I think visually, so this diagram helps me understand our role as a council, the framework for our work, our very hard work we've done. And you see council, but all of the people behind council, supporting council, and the entire organization of the city working to meet the city's responsibility as a municipality as it relates to options to support houselessness solutions. This is intended to provide context of how and where the city can allocate very limited resources when it comes to addressing the current national houselessness, regional houselessness, state houselessness crisis. I'm going to start with the policy and code changes that many of you are familiar with because I know you followed them closely and you've helped form them. Examples of that are the municipal code changes that we made regarding safe parking. Managing right-of-ways, that's the administrative policy that the city used when encampments have become unsafe, both for the people who are using the encampments and the people near the encampments. Development code changes. That's this last process that we went through regarding the shelter code amendments. Those are the kinds of policy and code changes the city has the ability to make in order to better serve people experiencing homelessness, in order to better serve the housed community who are their neighbors. We also have in our toolbox infrastructure and capital investments. And I like to say that if you look at what a government is focused on, look at their goals, look at their budget, and look at what this city has done in terms of infrastructure and capital investments. We have a council goal of at least 500 shelter beds. We have increased shelter capacity. Some of the more visible examples of that are the motel acquisitions, Project Turnkey, Rainbow, as well as the 2nd Street Shelter and the Lighthouse Navigation Center. We also have within our toolbox funding opportunities. We have been blessed recently in the midst of this crisis with federal and state funding opportunities. Under ARPA, under state and federal funding that allow for pass-through to nonprofits, who are professionally trained, who are the ones providing the services to people experiencing homelessness, who are skilled at direct services to unhoused. Examples of that are the Navigation Center operational funds from the state of Oregon, the ARPA funds that we used for community service providers. Finally, and one of the most, I believe, sustainable and lasting tools that we have are regional partnerships. I'm very proud of the work that this government has done to partner with cities throughout the county. And we have formed the Collaborative Office on Homelessness with Deschutes County. This allows the city to engage in innovative programs and leverage very limited resources, very limited city resources that we must use effectively. I want to turn to just some of the current city projects and programs. We can hit the next slide. So I talked about in the last slide some of the tools we have to address our houselessness crisis. This slide provides specific examples of how we have worked to fulfill that mission. This council started almost 2 years ago with changes in our municipal code to allow for the safe parking program. Then we made some significant investments in infrastructure and capital projects, including the purchase of several properties that leverage state and federal funding opportunities. Building on the continuum of housing options, we've contracted with Central Oregon Villages to complete phase 1 for a temporary outdoor shelter, which will create 20 additional temporary shelter beds. Undertaking the shelter code amendments within our development code provided the option for various types of shelters to be built in most zoning districts. Most of you, or many of you, were there for the shelter code amendments, so I know you're familiar with those. I know you also understand that state law also allows shelters to be built in many places in our city. It has been a very busy and focused time for the city. We have a diverse community with members who have different views about this issue, but you have all provided very valuable input. You've all worked hard in helping us develop and manage these projects and programs, and that now leads us to the important work of providing clarity to our community, regulatory clarity to our community regarding how and where we regulate our public space, including rights of way through common sense regulation that both keeps people who are struggling safe and honors our obligation to make sure that this community is safe and fair for everybody who lives in it. So now I'll turn to creating the camping code. Many of you are aware of the administrative policies over the past few years that have allowed us to better guide our role as stewards of the city's rights of way, of city property that we all have an obligation to make sure is available for the public. We need more clarity and direction for our whole community related to camping in our city. In our last open house, people asked, why are you doing this now when there is still lack of capacity of needed shelter beds? This is not a standalone project. I hope you can tell by the context that we've set for this work that it involves a multitude of strategies. This is the one that we're focused on tonight. Good regulation in the context of the work that this city has done on shelters and supporting our partners. This is one piece of a very complicated puzzle. We have an administrative policy on removing camps from city right-of-way already when they've been declared unsafe campsites following an assessment. The majority of cities in the Ninth Circuit, the majority of cities around the West have camping codes to regulate camping when shelters are not available. A camping code creates some structure that would make encampments less problematic. When there are no rules, circumstances at camps are more likely to deteriorate, and you find other cities sweeping camps in those situations. People camping need good regulation. People not camping in our city need good regulation. Chaos and lack of regulation does not serve our obligation to this community. I'll now turn it over to City Manager Eric King.
Thank you. If we go to the next slide, this graphic provides some context to the information that was just shared in terms of our capacity for shelter beds here in Central Oregon. So we have a point in time count that is done every year to assess how many folks are unsheltered in our Tri-County area. And it's, as the red line indicates, a sad statistic of steadily increases in our unsheltered population. Our sheltered population, those that are seeking shelter, is the line in yellow, and the actual capacity is the bar chart in blue. So as noted, we've been increasing capacity of our shelter beds with purchase of hotels. You're seeing efforts beyond just city direct funding, like the St. Paul Village that just opened. There's been some support there. City and county came together to help fund Veterans Village. All of that is included in that capacity, but there's still a large gap of folks that are living unsheltered in our community. So the question about why, when we're not quite there, I think the idea is we know it's very difficult to have a one-for-one match, but what we want to do is provide more opportunities. And our nation statistic is that about 37% of folks that are homeless have access to shelter. In Central Oregon, that statistic is unfortunately about 79-80% of our community is unsheltered. So that's that issue that we're trying to demonstrate tonight is how multidimensional this is, and increasing capacity is definitely something that's on our work plan. And going to the next slide, it's on a specific council goal of increasing shelter beds to 500 over a 2-year period. We do 2-year goals, and we align those resources to meet those goals. So we've made progress. We're about 1 year into our 2-year goal. We need more opportunities, and we have limited funds available to us, but we're doing our best to advocate both at a local level with our partners in city and county, but also with the state legislature. We have formed a coalition of other mid-sized cities. Gresham's, Hillsborough, Beaverton, Medford, Salem, Eugene, all are under this exact same situation. So we need help from the state. We can't do this alone. So speaking of which, the next slide is kind of an accounting of what the city has received in terms of additional revenue and where those dollars have been applied. So as the Mayor Pro Tem has mentioned, we've been fortunate with access to American Rescue Plan or ARPA funds. We also have had both of this local level funds allocated directly to the city of Bend, as well as acquiring some funds from the state and other partnerships through the county. So this is an accounting of all of those efforts over this 2-year period. 19.1 million that has been allocated, and you can see the breakdown of shelter acquisition, shelter operations, our outdoor shelter that's underway. These are budgeted funds, so some of these have not been fully expended as of yet. We also have received some funds from the legislature on cleanup efforts when we do have camp removal efforts or other cleanup that needs to take place in association with unsanctioned camping. From the revenue, so on the revenue side, 19.1 million, most of that, majority of that, over 13 million is from outside funds. The Rainbow Hotel is the one exception that those funds, that facility was purchased with issuing long-term debt that is paid for out of the general fund to allow us maximum flexibility for long-term needs, including more affordable housing, city facility needs. So we wanted maximum flexibility, but that is not money that's coming directly out of that fund. As of right now, it's spread out over a period of 20 years. Right, I'm going to turn this over to Ian Leitheiser, our Assistant City Attorney, to give you a little bit more of a framework for this project, and will help kind of provide, I think, some important context as to the information that we're seeking on clarity and questions from those of you either in person or online.
Thanks, Eric. First, going to talk about the scope of this project, what will and won't be covered, because that's important. What we are looking at are regulations that will cover camping on public property owned or controlled by the city. No problem. So generally speaking, that will encompass public streets, sidewalks, undeveloped public/city rights of way, and other property that is owned or controlled by the city, like city parking lots, vacant land, other city facilities. So that's what we are looking at creating regulations for. What we are not doing are regulating uses of private property or property owned or controlled by other public entities such as ODOT, the park district, that is not the city. I think most people know that, but not everyone does, the school district, et cetera. We are looking forward to getting engagement and input from those entities, because a collaborative approach to solve these problems is always better, but we cannot necessarily tell them what to do and how to do it and how they regulate camping on property that they own. So that's the scope. So next slide, I'm going to talk about kind of the legal foundation. If we can move to the next, oh, there we go. Okay. So first, federal law. We have federal and state law to think about. On the federal level in particular, we have cases that have told us it is unconstitutional to punish somebody for sleeping or resting on public property outside when they don't have a place to go, when they don't have a shelter they can go to. The way this is determined, it has to happen on an individual basis. So you have to do an individualized assessment of a particular person's access to shelter to determine whether they can be cited if you have a code in place. This is not a particularly new or novel concept. There's a line of cases interpreting the Eighth Amendment that have said for a long time in other contexts, you cannot punish people based on their status. You can punish people based on choices they make or conduct they engage in. And in recent cases, the courts have said, essentially, if somebody is homeless, they don't have a place to go, they eventually need to sleep. And if they have to sleep outside, that is not something that government should be able to punish them for. So these recent cases dealing with homelessness are an extension of concepts that have existed in the cases for quite some time. And they distinguish between essentially conduct and status and choices and things that humans simply have to do, one of which is sleeping. So while we are working within that framework, the cases do allow cities to adopt reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions or regulations on how people use public place. These cases are public places, excuse me. These cases do not create a constitutional right to camp or sleep outside on public property anywhere at any time in any manner. So what we are working on are those time, place, and manner regulations that will regulate how this can happen when it does need to happen. Next slide, we're going to talk about some of the state law issues. So this is something that has existed for quite some time. There is due process, a certain amount of due process protections built into state law. This is not new, that govern how cities and counties have to conduct themselves when they are removing established campsites from public property. Those requirements include 72 hours of notice before removing an established campsite and an obligation to store any personal property removed from those sites. Again, these are not new. These are state law requirements that have existed for quite some time. Next, and this is more recent, we have recent state legislation, House Bill 3115, and what this is intended to do is codify the Martin v. Boise standard. It's not really intended to create new law, but in Oregon, what it means two things. It means cities do have the authority to regulate sleeping or keeping warm and dry outdoors on public property. It also says to the extent cities choose to do that, which is what we are choosing to look at in Bend, those regulations have to be objectively reasonable for persons experiencing homelessness. Finally, third issue of state law, and this is really not central to this project, but since we sometimes get input or comments or questions about vagrancy laws, I thought it was worth noting that Oregon has a statute that essentially says vagrancy laws in Oregon are not a thing. Cities can't have them. This has existed for quite some time too. So next slide, and the last slide that I'm going to cover. This is a summary of a potential code framework. Again, we're getting input from council, but there is no code drafted, so consider this conceptual at this point. But what this lays out is that a city can have a prohibition on camping on public rights of way. That's okay. It's okay as long as you enforce it in the right way. And that means you can't punish somebody by a citation when that individual doesn't have a place to go. In order to figure that out, you have to do an individualized assessment of this person that may be violating your code to determine whether that particular person has access to a shelter. It is not quite as simple as simply counting available spaces in a shelter, because there are certain reasons why somebody might have access to a shelter or might not have access to a shelter, even if that shelter has space. In other words, there are reasons that shelters don't take people. And if a shelter won't take a particular person, the cases tell us that you probably shouldn't consider that person as having access to a shelter, and that impacts whether you can cite them or not. However, all of that aside, you can still have objectively reasonable time, place, and manner regulations that manage and reduce the impact of the public camping that will probably continue occurring until we have shelter for everybody who needs it. So that's what we've been spending time getting council input on over the last several council meetings, and we'll continue getting council input on as we work on drafting a code. Any code that we have is going to have the ability to have some discretionary enforcement and suspension of enforcement in circumstances that might suggest it's appropriate. So that's the legal framework.
Right, I think now, are we going to move to questions from any members?
We can, do we?
Actually, yeah, one more slide.
See your mirror. I'm happy to go through it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Next steps. For those of you who have been attending our meetings over the last couple of months, you've seen that we've given feedback on time, place, and manner preferences at 4 work sessions. Starting in June, we have held 1 informational open house, and tonight is our second. These, again, are intended to introduce the community to the process, the project, answer questions about that process. The city attorney's office has begun drafting a proposed code. And on our work session agendas for meetings in September, October, November, currently, we will be taking this issue up. September 7th is our next roundtable meeting structure discussion. We do plan to hold roundtable meetings in September and October. The stakeholders will include service providers, impacted unhoused individuals, council advisory bodies, businesses, public agencies, community groups, and I would echo what Ian offered. My expectation is that we'll have input from other governments who are like-minded and working on the same issues. The community is invited right now and will continue to be invited to provide feedback directly to council. You can always email us, council@bendoregon.gov, or speak at council meetings, or call any of us. Also, as I said before, and I'm not sure if that URL was correct before, but bendoregon.gov/camping, either dash code or camping code for more information. If you want to know whether these scheduled events get rescheduled, as tonight we had to reschedule location, please follow closely. The goal, again, is to have as much public input back and forth as possible. I do just want to touch on roundtable meetings and the difference between those and open houses. Open houses are information provided by city councilors and staff on the camping code legal context and process. You are in one right now. Time allocated for questions from the public will be related to the code process tonight. The roundtable meetings are different. These are a new tool that we have. They allow us to participate more closely with community engagement. These were created by the council rules in May of 2022. These are designed to give us a forum to candidly discuss matters that are of concern to you. These are for discussion, debate. You cannot take a formal action or vote in the course of a roundtable. I think they're a valuable tool to continue to communicate better as a community. The outcomes can include a lot of different things. A referral to a city subcommittee, a city board, or a commission for further refinement, action, direction, or education. And the format of those meetings will be set by the mayor or majority of council at a prior public meeting. My expectation is you will have a clear expectation of what you are coming to if you are coming to a roundtable meeting. Now we're going to turn to asking questions about process. I'll turn it over to Manager King.
Great, thank you. So some basic ground rules that are up here. We are now going to open the floor for you to ask a question. You have 1 minute to ask that question. We ask that you limit it to one question so that we can get through everybody. If we have time, we can circle back and do more questions that you didn't get. We can circle back around for a second question if you have it. Our goal is to try to provide some information here. And we know that we have folks both in person in this chambers as well as folks online. So we're going to rotate in between in person. We'll do 2 at a time. And then those that are online as well. And so I'm going to ask, Shelley will help facilitate the time as well as call up folks and so that you're prepared to speak.
Great. So if you have those completed forms, the sign-in sheets, if you have one that you haven't turned in yet, if you'll pass it down to the end of the row, I'll pick those up. We have 2 speakers. The first 2 to come up to the podium here are Luke Richter and Mike Satcher. And then on deck will be Linda Muir and Chris Nelson.
Do I need to do anything to this? Just first, I just wanted to bring up that I believe y'all are doing the community a little bit of a disservice right now, and yourselves a disservice by trying to work on this in the midst of what happened. Just looking in the eyes of all of you, I think you understand that, and at least myself as a community member, expect the best work out of you when it comes to something that's going to impact a lot of people here. So I hope you think about that. I hope you add another session like this so that more of the community can be engaged, because I imagine that a lot of people are not paying attention to what is happening right now. And no matter what side of the aisle, they should be paying attention to what is happening right now, because this does impact Bend moving forward, as this will be the first code. Since I couldn't get the meeting rescheduled today, the question that I do have, is there been any talk of adding some sort of trigger clause or something when there's X amount of beds or percentage amount of beds available finally for people to get in, so that once this code finally is in place, then it's not going to immediately just completely impact somebody. It's going to impact somebody when there is an extreme chance that they'll be able to get in somewhere.
Do you want to talk about the individualized?
Yeah, I mean, I can try to answer that. I think 2 things. One, you can only cite somebody under a code like this if they don't have a place to go. So that will, I'm not a decision maker. My recommendation is that is going to be built into the code. So that individualized assessment is going to be, we're going to have presumably a section in the code on how enforcement works and requiring that individualized assessment of whether shelter is available for a particular person before they can be cited. So we wouldn't be breaking new ground on doing that. Other cities do that. It's a best practice, and it's the best way to ensure that your enforcement of whatever you end up with complies with the federal cases. And 2, I don't think this is exactly what you asked, but this idea that we're going to have at some point a code regulating how people live outside, and then people are going to be expected to just instantly change what they're doing and comply with it, is something that I am thinking about. So again, this is a council prerogative, but I could see, I won't say a phased implementation, but I could see some time between when a code would be when a code would be adopted by council and when it would be considered effective, because people will need some time to understand what it means and how it's going to work. So not my decision, but I think that's something that I would probably recommend council consider as they move forward with this.
And I would also kind of point to an example, a little different, but the transportation bond, for example. So that was referred to the voters, but alongside that was a resolution with commitment of citizen oversight, project lists, et cetera. So there could be some companion decisions that are being made, like here's the code, and then a resolution for some commitments on additional support or other things.
And I would say, as to your first question, I think that what you're talking about is required by the 8th Amendment of the US Constitution. So nothing that we're contemplating, I mean, the reason we're contemplating the protections that would be in this code is to comply with the Constitution.
So this is not a question for staff. This is a question for the policymakers. So the way it's being proposed right now, this code is going to require campers to break camp every morning and then set it up against every night. You discussed that at the last meeting. So these humans are then going to have to carry everything they own on their back all day long. This will create a cruel and unreasonable burden on disabled people in particular, and on anybody who's trying to keep a job. I suspect that the answer to this is going to be similar to the answer to the last question. You're going to talk about individual enforcement. That is not my question. Because those individuals are going to have to make these decisions not knowing whether you're going to enforce. So my question happens before that individual assessment. Which gamble should a person take? Should they risk their physical safety by complying with your code? Or should they risk their legal safety by not complying their code and taking care of their bodies and trying to find work? So which bad option would you recommend an individual choose?
I mean, from my perspective, it's a false choice. I don't think people need to make that choice. My expectation is that
Comply or not
Just let me answer the question. That service providers are going to be able to provide people with this individualized inquiry, the ability to comply with a code. I think it's.
How? Could you give me an example?
Let me finish. I think it's a little insulting to people experiencing homelessness to suggest that they don't know how to comply with regulation. We all in this community
Wow.
comply with even good regulation about how we all decide as a community. Just let me finish.
How does a disabled person choose? How do they comply with the code when they have to carry everything they own on their back all day long? A person who can't walk, for example,
Sure. Let me
how
answer,
do they
let me answer
comply?
the question. If under an individualized inquiry, somebody does not have a shelter bed available to them because of a disability.
See, and you're answering the question I said was not my question.
Okay, well, then we're going to have to continue to work on this.
Councillor Perkins, do you
Let
have
me
an
finish.
answer?
Let me finish.
Councillor Perkins, you've answered. Councillor
Sir,
Perkins, do you
sir,
have an answer?
this is a question about process and not about substance. I will answer your question. I will finish answering your question. This is a carefully crafted code. It will be. I'm confident in that. To ensure that people are being treated fairly, whether you are housed or unhoused, regulating time, place, and manner of camping in our community. Good common sense regulation about how we're all going to use public space that we all share.
None of that was my question. Councillor Perkins, do you have an answer?
I can look at it from sort of a different angle, and that
Could you
is,
please look at it from the angle in which I asked it?
Yeah.
Okay, that would be
yeah,
good.
that is the angle.
Yeah.
What I want to see going along with this code is how we're going to provide a solution for people in order to be able to follow this code, right? So if we say, for example, if you have a disabled person and we say you have to pack up your stuff every day, we need to make sure that we are supplying some form of basic needs for them, like a locker or something where they can actually put their belongings during the day.
So this disabled person will travel to their locker every day from their camp?
Well, I don't have the
Far away,
specifics on
how
your-
far away will the locker be?
This is all.
How are they going to get there? Are you going to provide a bus
I'm
route?
not actually
We need-
asking your question.
We need to keep
Yeah.
other, there's many folks that have questions. So if you have multiple questions, we can circle back with you.
Yeah, I would just like an actual answer to my question. What should a person choose? Should they comply and risk their physical safety? Should they not comply and risk their legal safety?
It's
That's
not-
my question.
It's not a real question.
I think the answer to your question is that.
I understand that you don't want to answer it. That doesn't mean it's not a real question.
Let us answer your questions.
I would love for you to answer my question.
We're going to move on to somebody else who gets their turn.
Okay, please answer the question I asked.
We are continuing to craft a code that doesn't put people in ridiculous scenarios like you've described.
You are crafting a code that does put people in that scenario.
About process to craft a substantive code
Yeah.
that provides safe, well-reasoned regulation about how we're all, housed or unhoused, going to use our public space.
These are all things you discussed at the last meeting. You are planning to put this restriction on people.
That's the answer to your question. We're going to move on to the next question. Thank you.
Well,
We appreciate it.
and I didn't expect you to answer it because you're a liar and you don't actually understand these.
Thank you for coming out. We
Situations.
appreciate it.
Go online. So I think we have at least one virtual caller. So Lisa, do you want to go ahead and bring that person on board?
Yes, I have Dennis. Dennis, you have the ability to unmute yourself now.
Hi, good evening, folks. I have a short statement and then a question to ask of the group. The statement is that in all of the legal structure, there's nothing against prioritizing the people that get this benefit. And I think that there's half and half between those who are, well, I don't know, there's some fraction who are working but cannot afford to live in Bend. And there's the other half which can't work or won't work for any variety of reasons. Priority should be given to the people that have jobs My question is, given all this money, when does it stop? The budget keeps going up. When does the city finally say enough? I'm a taxpayer and you've gotten real close to where's enough for me. Thank you, Badger.
I think the question is around kind of resources, if I'm gathering that correctly. And as I was saying earlier, we understand the intense amount of resources that it takes. I would say there's a lot of system failures of lack of access to housing, to treatment. There's many big system challenges that we're not going to solve alone as a city. So we are going to require other partners that we talked about with the county and with the state legislature. Really, the federal government also needs to play its part. There's been talk about increasing vouchers and access to private housing as well. I mean, they're all part of the solution.
And I guess just a sort of a question back to you, Dennis. So the city says enough, but then what? We can't just say enough and the problem goes away. We have to continue, dealing with the fact that we have a massive houselessness problem in our community. We can't just wash our hands of it and pretend that it isn't happening.
So the taxpayers will continue to subsidize this forever.
Well, I think I would direct you to the earlier slides about the funding resources for what we've actually spent. Certainly, a lot
But
of
the
it
funding
comes-
resources will run out.
Let me answer your question. We're talking about process and drafting a code. This is a process to determine a time, place, and manner code about where people can camp. You have a very good question, holistically, philosophically. I would love for you to ask it at a council meeting because I think it's worthwhile. Right now, we're talking about regulating public space that really belongs to all of us and making sure that it is usable for all of us and safe for all of us.
The comment is to prioritize then.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Linda Muir and Chris Nelson, please.
Good evening, everybody. I actually asked this question once before, but I'd like to ask it again, maybe a little more pointedly this time. The mindset of this code going forward. As I asked last time, it seems like the mindset is mostly towards the best way to punish the most vulnerable members of our community. And I'm just a little bit curious why we couldn't take the same strategy and just how to actually help people. Just giving an example here, if I sit here and do this, you guys kind of have a couple options to get me to stop. You can either say, hey, you got to leave, or we're going to throw you in jail. You're going to do all this stuff. Or you could say, hey, you might not want to do that. You could be breaking your own phone. You've got a nice soft pocket. There's all these reasons why you should do it for your own self-help. Which one do you think is the better option? To come at people aggressively and impose restrictions and possibly jail, all this other things, or just take all this time and money that we're spending at these meetings and all this effort being put into this code and reorganize that effort into helping the people get off the streets, which will also solve the entire camping issue. Again,
I have to stop because
Yep.
a little bit over. I think the question is, why aren't we doing more to provide services directly to people experiencing homelessness, which I think is a fair question. And I would just direct you to the whole first half of the presentation about all of the things that this government and coordinating with other governments has done to make sure that there are safe places for people to be and that there are resources. And I continue to believe that the individualized inquiry in what is essentially the standard code in the Ninth Circuit to regulate public space does that. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But it is the tool that governments have to regulate public space, which we all need to have the ability to access.
it's also the impression that you're putting forward towards what the city's reaction is towards vulnerable citizens.
And I think that's a fair criticism.
Is that our first point of action is to punish instead of help.
Yeah, and so in the context of all of the work that the city, the county now, the state, the advocacy we're doing with the federal government to provide more services to people so that they are not subject to regulation that doesn't fit their situation. I think you can't look at the work that we're doing in regulating public space in a vacuum. I appreciate the question.
Hi, thank you. Is the city willing to commit to placing buffers around schools, residential neighborhoods, and other homeless shelters?
Yes,
For camping.
we've talked about it. We haven't talked about, we haven't made any decisions at the council level. Each of the items that you've just described are issues that council will take up in crafting this code. I don't know which way we will come down, but it's certainly they are all issues that we have discussed and will continue to discuss.
Okay, thank you.
The direction council has provided so far has been to not allow outdoor camping in residential areas, which coincidentally are the site of many, if not most, of the schools in the Ben LaPointe School District. So that direction has been provided on that already.
And other shelters?
We have an administrative policy that creates buffers around established shelters, and not a decision maker, but our draft code will likely continue that element of that's currently in the administrative policy.
What is that buffer?
1,000 feet for the navigation center and 500 feet for other permitted shelters, including safe parking.
Right, thank you.
Our next two in-person speakers are Matthew Engel and Jocelyn Bryant. We have no more callers online.
Thank you.
I want to first apologize for that disturbance earlier. I thought, oh, I'll get on the Zoom and not have to get up and get one of the sheets. And then that was, best laid plans. I am a tiny, tiny part of our foster system here. And so I guess my question is probably mostly for Ian and Mike. Does this code include anything for the evaluation of children? Can you go in, and if these people are in violation of this code and they have children, what is the process there?
So I'll address part of it. Earlier commenter mentioned people with disabilities, and we have to not just write, but have an understanding of how we enforce regulations that accommodates for the reality that people with disabilities live on the street and that families with children and unaccompanied minors live on the street. So that is something, those are both things we are considering as we draft this. And I think maybe more importantly, there are things that we are going to have to consider in terms of how we enforce this and perhaps use our discretion to make sure that those situations can be, let's say, appropriately and equitably dealt with. In terms of creating opportunities for assessment of minors, that's probably outside the scope of what we're talking about with regulating public space. But if the chief has any comments, I'd welcome them.
No, thanks. I think it's along the lines of what Ian said. Is right now, since it's not drafted, I don't have any specifics around what it might entail, but I think the biggest part of that is understanding how discretion is used along tools of gaining compliance. And like I've said before, is truly the enforcement of something like this is almost what feels like would be a last ditch effort to gain some sort of compliance around the expectations of the community and accountability to the code. Mm-hmm. So the intent, or at least from my perspective, I'll say, is that our role would not be to find, families or youth experiencing homelessness and then find a way to cite them. That goal especially is how do we get those people help?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a follow-up question after you. If there are no.
I have two questions. One, is there a part of this code that has an effort to identify who's who of the homeless so we can decide on what their needs are and can meet them better? Seems like there's
that already exists. And that's not something that the city does. That's something that our service providers do. It's the coordinated entry system. That's how they evaluate each person and their specific needs. Yeah. That's something that service providers would do and continue to do under this code.
And my expectation, and it's not related to the camping code, but I think it's good for folks to know. My expectation is that the collaborative office, moving the continuum of care also under COIC, all of the resources that we're pouring into the coordinated entry system are going to improve the data, improve the services that we're offering to people experiencing homelessness, and have more individualized plans to graduate people out. When we know who people are, when we know what they need, like we've seen the success at Veterans Village, because we know who's there, we know what they need, we know how to graduate them out of homelessness. That's probably a conversation for our collaborative office with the county and all of the other cities in Deschutes County, but it's important in terms of, the bigger picture.
Yeah. The other last question was, it seems like there's different levels of street camping and a lot of people prefer to stay in their automobiles or their vans or school buses or whatever, and there's no way to move things around. They just kind of move in. Is there a spot that we can create that would be a safe place for people to move those from the street to the safe place to camp at night?
Our safe parking program you've just described.
And my business is over by the OSU campus and I can drive through there every morning.
Yep.
And I can tell you there's 12 to 15 vans there at night.
Yep.
Yeah, it's getting to be ridiculous. And we're having more, garbage, graffiti, property damage. And there's no tools to, on one hand, give them a safe place. On the other hand, don't allow that to happen just anywhere. And it's right by 2 schools. So I don't know what kind of buffer there is for that, but.
So as Councilor Perkins mentioned, we have a safe parking program, which is designed to create opportunities for people to have safe places to park off and camp off the street. But that question of how do we as a city want to regulate the activity of people taking shelter in vehicles is something that council is going to be discussing. So to me, it's a little bit of a distinct category within this regulatory project, but it is something we are going to be talking with council about at the next meeting during the work session at the September 7th meeting. But that is one of the issues, is there a way or are there reasons to allow people to use their vehicles for shelter and mitigate some of the impacts? I mean, no trash, no garbage. I think that might go a long way towards addressing some of what people see, but we're going to be talking about what other cities do and what approach we want to take in Bend at subsequent meetings.
And I just have to note, so I know we said one question, we're being a little flexible here. How many folks do we have signed up?
We have 2 online now and we have 1 more.
Okay, so I think we're okay. So go ahead if you have a second question. I'm going to allow a little flexibility because we've got another 45 minutes or so, or 40 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So in line with the parking, for example, Hunnell Road, and please stop me if I should come back for a different meeting. But I guess my question is, how often are you we clearly have parking regulations in the city of Bend. So how often are you going up to Hunnell Road, and do you have the authority to knock on those doors and see if there are children in those trucks or RVs or what's already up there, because you have the excuse, not the excuse, pardon me, because you have the code of parking to be encountering those people?
Yeah, it's I understand the question around are we encountering children or families up there? This is really what you're focusing on. We're on Hunnell Road in that area frequently, daily, for a variety of reasons. Some of it around calls for service, some of it around welfare checks, and some around proactive enforcement or engagement around parking issues. We primarily are looking to completely abandoned vehicles out there to remove those. That's what we've been doing for the last couple of months. Is we get a lot of vehicles that are dumped and we remove those. When we encounter children or a family with children, we have the same standards applied in that situation as we do any standard when we come to a housed family. People have to make sure their children are safe, they have the appropriate food and opportunity to care for them, and that their welfare is being taken care of. And that doesn't really apply differently to someone who is unhoused or housed. So we look at the same standards around that. We look for any children and then report that with our partners at DHS if we need to.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
We have 2 online callers, virtual callers. So this is what I'm gonna introduce those.
M. Dickinson, you should now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Good evening. Thank you for the time. First of all, I appreciate the City Council queuing this up in light of the current projects that are on tap. Shout out to the Division Street Shelter, the Lighthouse, the Franklin Avenue, a number of temporary options that have been discussed. I've been on many of those meetings in the past. My question is around equity in the distribution of the shelters across Bend. We need obviously shelter solutions with this camping code. All of the shelter solutions are on the east side of town. The answer that's been provided on some of the shelter meetings, why there are no shelter options on the west side of town, is that no property is owned over there. However, I did notice that the recent property purchase One of those was actually by Les Schwab and Albertsons, again in the southeast part of town. So my request is, as we look at those current projects and programs to create shelter capacity to help the camping issue, please consider purchasing or acquiring land on the west side of town so we have equitable distribution of the shelters across Bend and the associated benefits for our unhoused communities across Bend. And maybe someone could provide context at why there have been no new purchases on the west side. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I can maybe provide a little information. I think some of the recent purchases have all been hotels or shelters. And those are hotels that are, maybe have kind of outlived some of their use, and they're all up and down, really the center part of town, up and down 3rd Street. We don't find those properties on the west side of town. I will say, though, the shelter code that council recently approved really looked at equitable kind of policies and zoning codes, which really apply evenly throughout the city. As noted earlier, the city doesn't provide any direct services. We contract with providers, so we really count on our partners to identify locations, not just public property, but privately owned property as well. But I understand your concern, and I think it's something that we need to continue to focus on. And there's fair housing policies that council will be reviewing more globally as part of our consolidated plan. It's a 5-year plan that identifies how we support not just our unhoused community, but in more general terms, affordable housing in Bend.
I appreciate that answer. And I would like to point out, as you said, a lot of the hotels that have been acquired for shelters are in Southeast, Northeast. However, the property by Les Schwab and Albertsons is actually a vacant plot of land. And so I assume that there's also vacant plot of lands on the west side, and would appreciate consideration of those in the future to equitably, geographically distribute some of the shelter capacity in the future. Obviously, a 5-year plan, it takes a long time to acquire land, but I see nothing on the docket looking at the west side to date.
And I don't know if we got that person's name for the record. Did you have it online?
Sure. I've been on a number of the shelter meetings, Michelle Dickinson, and thank you again for your response to the question.
Oh, thank you. Michelle Dickinson. Okay.
Michelle, are you a resident of Bend or live inside the city of Bend?
Apologies, I couldn't hear that.
Do you live in Bend?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
It sounds like we might have another online caller.
Yes, we have Kara. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hi there, thank you. I have a question about policy really directed at the city attorney. I've listened to the meetings through the video replay, and I've heard discussions of building in discretion. I understand that concept when it's applied to the city manager and the need to contemplate weather events and other emergency situations. I'm curious about how we're going to build in discretion for the application of the code for the other people, I guess the police officers that will be employing it. To me, that language seems problematic just because we don't want selective enforcement, and the code needs to be very narrowly drawn. Thanks for taking my question.
Yeah, I'll start an answer and then maybe turn to the police chief, because I think I can recall him hearing say that discretion is what, 80-90% of police work maybe. But so really quickly, you raise a really interesting point. How do you have even-handed, consistent enforcement and also have the right amount of discretion to deal with sort of real-world situations and trying to apply a code to them? I mean, the best answer is that we try. It's really hard to guarantee that that's going to be right every time. But one thing that I have considered is the idea of an administrative. Once we end up with a code, the idea of an administrative policy that would sort of underlie that code and provide some guidance on how we carry out enforcement to ensure that the right kind of discretion is included. But there's a part of me that doesn't. This is something that enforcement folks, whether they're code enforcement or law enforcement or others, do every day, and it's ingrained in how they do their work. I mean, police have never cited or arrested everyone for every single violation that they see. That's not practical. It's not always appropriate. And so it's built into how they do this. And as the chief said earlier, the sort of final act of citing somebody for a violation of this code is almost always going to be considered a last resort if they can't get compliance, just like it is for many, many other legal requirements, whether they be in the code or in state law.
Thank you. I think you bring up a really good question about building discretion into a written code. I've often thought about how that's going to look if it's drafted and what that will be, because once it's code, it's code. So a lot of it really does revolve around intent and spirit of the ordinance and what we're trying to do with it as a community. And like I said before, and like what the city attorney just reiterated, is a significant amount of this work in law enforcement specifically is about discretion and what tools and ordinances, laws, and you use to solve the problem. There is very little discretion built into the Oregon laws. The laws say thou shalt not do this and not do that. But it doesn't say we will arrest or cite everyone every time we approach somebody for those violations or law issues. So there's only a very small number of laws that we are required to take action on, and those have no discretion. And that's built into the ordinance or the codes as well. So again, yes, the concern is that without any clear direction or intent that it could be overutilized. I think that's always a concern, but again, that's how we move forward as a police department, with the intent of the council and what I'm sure will be written in some sort of administrative policy about how we enforce the ordinance.
Would you entertain a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was a public defender in Deschutes County for many years, and so I'm somewhat familiar with police discretion. One thing that I don't know that we've discussed at this meetings is the fact that the unhoused community includes intravenous drug users. My concern, like if I can speak frankly to a scenario, is that if we are building in discretion, we will have enforcement directed at people who are chronic drug users and not at other people. I mean, the idea that we're drafting a code now that relies heavily on discretion, it sort of contravenes notions of like crafting law, in my opinion. And I think that this phraseology, building in discretion, is also used to sort of quell people's concerns about, the over enforcement of the laws. Like this idea that at 7 a.m. everyone needs to pack up and go. I mean, that's my position. I guess it's no longer a question about policy, but I appreciate you entertaining my comments.
I mean, that makes a lot, just from a policy perspective, I agree that I think the building discretion into a code is fraught and it has to be done correctly. So we need to do that very carefully. I also just want to note that we've heard in council meetings, I believe from multiple counselors, at least we've heard it from me, that the first contact with folks who could be subject to this code should not be a law enforcement officer. And I am heartened by Chief Krantz's approach that enforcement, nuts and bolts enforcement of this would be a last resort. I am also encouraged by how much passion and commitment there is in this community to serve people who are struggling. And we do not provide services at the city. We do not provide direct services. So it's important for us to work together with governments who do, like the Public Health Authority for this ground that we're all sitting on right now, which is the county, making sure that the first response to somebody who could be subject to citation or subject to enforcement of this code is not from a law enforcement officer.
And just to expand on that, there is a position that is in our transportation and mobility department that is focused on managing the rights of way and the code that follows it. So really our intention is to have their first point of contact be, as mentioned, non-law enforcement, really somebody with a public health and safety kind of background, looking at how the right of way is being used. It could involve, depending on the circumstance, other partners. If there is an immediate safety concern, of course, law enforcement would be involved. But for kind of much of what we're talking about here in terms of time, place, and manner would be through that office.
Thank you.
There are no more online or virtual callers. We have 3 more in person, Jose Guzman and Rachel Brower. Next.
How's it going, guys? Sorry I look like shit. I live outside.
It's okay.
How are you guys doing today? Good. So, you guys like to ask me a question about how it is to be homeless right now, or would you like to jump in and ask a question?
You can ask any questions of us regarding the process on this code.
Okay, so I'm gonna take a thing right now. So if homeless people right now, if donations are being bought that I donated already to society, right? And used as a manipulation tactic so they can gain beneficial or physical, whether it's repercussions or benefit from it, say reform, right? Wouldn't that be against that rule? Wouldn't that be cheating? Because I know I sacrificed everything, the money I made from my music, 400 songs, mind you, since 2012, all my clothes, all my stuff, my cars, my house, my dogs, shit's been stolen. I've been framed for a lot of shit by police, by people, by citizens and officials. That's why I kind of knew everybody was here already. Why is it fair for me and all the people that I believe in to starve and suffer while there's other people trying to oppress us at the same moment simultaneously when police don't do shit about it? How's that fair? As an American citizen, that's my first, ninth, and probably all my amendments fucked off, right? That's not fair. Lost for words, that's crazy, huh? So let me get another example. In Klamath Falls, right? I was dealing with people who probably weren't the people I should be associating with, but due to my belief that everyone deserves a second chance and someone to believe in them, right? Someone to stand by and actually confide in them that won't abandon them or frame them for something they did because they're cowards, you know? That 1 minute could suck a dick. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna say this. No offense, pardon my language.
Right.
Sorry.
Just, if you,
God, but listen.
if you will ask your question, we'll give other.
Why are my people suffering? Why are my people the ones that I gave all my stuff to for them? Why are other people benefiting from that when they already have so much? Why are they continuously filling their cup when everyone else hasn't even had a drink? That's my question.
Thank you.
Does anyone have an answer?
I do not have an answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Sorry to hear that. That sucks, huh? Well, I know a lot more than that, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people would like talk to me about that, but I'm fine.
He's fine. Take your hand off.
But I gotta go because I'm proud. I'm a proud American man. I stand up and will die for my people. Would you guys? You know? Have a good day.
Thank you.
So my question is, going back to a thing that was previously discussed, that if we are able to create all of the resources, then selective enforcement will be easier, correct? That's kind of the gist of this, is if all the resources happen, then we can rely on selective enforcement based on individual basis, right?
Help me understand what you mean by selective enforcement.
Well, so the thing is going back to the case of someone who is differently abled than us, then the idea is that there would be resources, so then they don't have to make a choice between their physical safety and their legal safety, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my question is wouldn't a better maybe path or timeline for this is to wait until those things are in place before we discuss a code that would make someone have to make those decisions? And is that a possibility, or are we just going to go ahead and decide this code is more important than people having to make impossible decisions every single day?
I think it's definitely, we've heard conversation at council that there's definitely a possibility of not doing anything. I've heard people mention that in the community. It's been discussed at council. It is certainly among the menu of options. Council right now has directed staff to move forward with a camping regulation, but it's certainly a possibility.
I do have one other question, if that's possible.
Sure.
again, discussing the idea of of discretionary enforcement. If we are so willing to leave that up to police, and I get that you guys would like it to not be police first, but if we, as a nation, as people, had better statistics with police discretion on enforcement, movements like Black Lives Matter, Red Nation, all these things where it is proven over and over again that people who are the most marginalized are the ones who are targeted for enforcement. And I'm just wondering where the wisdom is with that. No, like, that's a thing that we know, that's been proven. Why is our solution to add additional police discretion? Can you explain the wisdom in that?
We haven't had the actual enforcement conversation. That's sort of what we keep not a stumbling block, but we keep sort of coming back to that during our discussions, during our work sessions, because it's still something that I think we're all trying to wrap like our minds around. How can we do this in a way that's in any way equitable, yet provide some form of regulatory framework for our community? So I would just say that at this point, we're still not there yet. We don't have an answer to your question, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet on the code. I certainly think that's a hugely important part of the process. And it will be one of the work sessions that we have to talk about enforcement. I think going back to Kara's question, I think we are, at least I am, keenly focused on not having discretion swallow the equitable provisions of this regulation, which should be on its face just a simple regulation of public property that we all essentially own at some level. So I think, to answer your question, it's a very delicate situation when it comes to enforcement, and we have to be extremely careful, because I don't think you'll have anybody on council supporting a code that results in inequitable enforcement.
Then you should probably just be against it, because the fact that it regulates one person's time, place, and manner, access to sleep, and not everyone as a whole, it's already inequitable.
Thank you. I mean, there's just my perspective in response to your questions that doesn't. It's on its face, it's just regulating time, place, and manner of an activity and not a person. And if it started to regulate
sleep,
right.
Does this regulate your time, place, and manner, access to your sleep?
It would. If I were camping, it would regulate any time, place, and manner of anybody camping, no matter what their living situation is. And I realize that the impact of that could be inequitable, and that's why we have to be so careful in building the code and enforcing it, which, again, we're going to have a whole work session on enforcement. It's hugely critical.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Our last guest speaker is Linda, is it Muir? Sorry.
Hi again. I've always wondered why, since there's the KOA old campground that's been for sale on the north end of town, why that wouldn't be utilized, purchased with federal, state, county, city funds. We know there's been a windfall of ARPA money that's been spent elsewhere. So why is it? I've never gotten a good answer as to why, because it seems to me that it would be such a perfect, that if not that, then something else where people could go and have a great place to camp. There could be services. So what is the stumbling block?
$21 million.
Okay, fine, but we know that there's been 30 million that we've calculated that's been spent by the city in federal, state, county, city funds on purchasing different hotels. Right, but a campground up there could house a lot of people. And there could be more than just spaces for tents. It could be RVs, it could be, I just feel like maybe you guys need to try harder to get grants and funds. I know for a fact, because I've done the research, that 30 million, not 19.1, has been spent on solving homelessness in Bend, or trying to solve homelessness in Bend. So it seems to me that that is a solution that is staring us in the face, where it's sitting there vacant, has been for years, that we could provide a place so these people can safely camp and get showers and water and other neat services that they need. I really implore you to take a deeper look at your financing for that.
Thank you. I mean, I would also just continue to point folks in the community toward the county, which has floated this concept. And I don't think we could oppose it. I don't think we would oppose it if the county is willing to step up and provide some facilities that are actually safe. I think that would be a great additional tool to all of the things that the city has done. And I would think that it would be a useful exercise. The other thing to remember about acquiring property is that I will not support unmanaged, facilities that are not aimed at graduating people out of homelessness. Well, let me just finish. And so you can't just acquire land and then hope for the best. We have to provide services. So a lot of what you saw in terms of spending is very expensive because we have to focus on funding the service providers who actually do the work of getting people in shelters and getting people in homes.
If you've told us.
Well, ma'am, you can ask another question. And I don't want to get in a debate about finances because we've tried. But if you want to, if you want to come up and if we have time, you want to come and ask another question, you are welcome.
So you have constantly told us that the service providers are the one, because when we have questioned you about providing these shelters and the services on an ongoing fashion, and we are concerned about the finances of the city, and you have regularly told us that it's the service providers, they're going to be providing the services, it's their money. And now you're telling me that you have to fund the service providers to do their job. I'm not saying having a campground up there and just say, go camp. I'm saying a place that you could provide for those that don't want to go into the shelters or can't go into the shelters, give them a place that they can go and give them the wraparound services and give them a way to graduate out.
I think what you're hearing is we're all for it. I think that financially that's not within reach at this point in terms of acquisition of a facility that size and funding it so that it didn't fail immediately, because we would have to fund it and make sure that it was successful.
So you'd have to pay for the service providers to do their job.
Not necessarily, but do you want me to answer the rest of the question? I don't think that as a community, it's fiscally responsible to embark upon efforts that we don't have a plan to finish and to continue to fund the services that we know will ensure success for the people who are using these facilities. And I agree, it's a challenge.
I've held myself up here. Sorry. Two more. That's so Tom Hart as well and Jennifer.
Okay, so I'm really emotional. I know for everybody today, it's like really crazy. I would say there was a lot of people willing to die for people in this grocery store. And so that statement hit me pretty hard hearing that a little earlier. Are you willing to die? Yeah, people went in to save people, including employees and all those other things. Setting that aside, when larger camps have been brought up in other meetings or options or as solutions, it's called internment camp. That is quoting counselors in written form and in person and vocally as it's an internment camp. And for me, I don't want people to be living on the streets without showers and being able to flush toilets and all that. Like, I want people to have a place to go. And so we're hoping for a larger area to afford that for folks. It's a big deal. And it's sad that it's gone on as long as it has and that it's not a large camp. And I don't think it should be considered an internment camp. I think that's.
I don't think this council would support anything remotely like that.
It's been used in numerous meetings, numerous counselors.
I'm saying at least.
Yes, city councilors call it internment camps and I want people.
I hear what you're saying. I'll just answer real quickly. I recognize you from our shelter code conversations.
Yeah.
And it's good to see you again. I think the important thing to remember is all of that was built at providing the regulatory framework for facilities that we know succeed, Veterans Village, right? Things like that. So I think we're sort of singing from the same sheet of music, but I recognize that you're anxious for more resources and I appreciate that.
Yeah, just internment camp is just very inappropriate and misplaced, is my opinion.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Hart. Mr. Hart is hard.
Okay. Okay.
Good evening. My name is Tom Hart. I've lived here over 40 years, worked for the school district, and I'm retired. I want to thank you for taking on a tough task on this homeless issue, but I have an idea that I think it might work. This problem is not going to go away. And you look at these poor people, you wonder where their parents are, their brothers or sisters. And I think a lot of them are just worn out. They're welcome. They have no other place to go. I'm the oldest of 3 children, and I have a younger brother and a sister who's no longer living. She has failed life. She worked hard at it, but she just pissed her life away. So I'm not insensitive to what happens to these people. I think it'd be a good idea. There's still some property east of town, build a large barracks like a dorm. When I was in the service, I lived in a dorm and I had a little cubicle and a locker. And at the end of the dorm, there were 2 open doors to showers and toilets. It would be a good way to get people off the street. Any homeless veteran should have a place to stay there as long as they want to or need to until they get on their feet. Any women with children needs to be in one of these like motels that are being refurbished. But I have talked to some people that they're not homeless, but they're just shuffling around in life. They like to live in town. They told me they can put a tent anywhere they want. They're near the breweries. They don't have to camp up on the forest because it costs so much and there's time limits. So not everyone is exactly homeless, but if we had some kind of a barracks type thing with enough property, some people, they want to live in their tents no matter what. They're not looking for jobs. They just want to exist. Let them put their tents on the property. If the barracks or a dorm type situation, even the retired vets, they kind of run the thing. And when I was a young man, I traveled all through Europe after college, including in Europe and North Africa. And I stayed a lot of youth hostels. Maybe you've done it before, a little place to bunk down, a place to shower and have toilets, and you move on. But at least to get the people off the street. If we start letting people put their rolling wrecks like out from Hunnell Road on your driveways or people's streets, it's really going to destroy people's property value.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your comments. These are beyond the scope of our camping code conversation, but conversations that council's been having, I know the county commission's been having, and we need to keep having them. So I appreciate you bringing them forward, and please continue to do so.
I understand part of that, and what I want to do is just give you that advice when you talk to someone else about the ultimate solutions but we need to get them off the street.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Mike Krantz, congratulations, very professional job in handling that situation out there at Safeway.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody? We're done with. Just, I think the next step, so as the Mayor Pro Tem Broadman mentioned earlier, we will be having one more work session on September 7th, talking about vehicle camping. We'll also be talking about the roundtable discussions, which is another opportunity for engagement. That'll occur at the end of September, early October. We'll have the code available. Right now, our timeline is to have that code available in draft form on September 21st. There'll be opportunities also at during public comment sections of our council meetings. The intention of council at this point is to have the code in front of them for a vote in probably October, November timeframe. That's it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.